It's no secret that for the past few decades, Christian movies have really kind of stunk. Why is that? Well, today I'm going to give you a little bit of a theory. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, when I say that a Christian movie kind of stinks in one way or another, we could talk about various details of a movie. There have been ways in which acting in Christian movies has been not so great, or where the writing has been not so great, or where the production value hasn't been so great. But if you look around Hollywood, you can find different examples of this from one extent to another. But for me, I think that there's actually a much more profound problem underlying all of these other problems. Now, another Christian might come along and make a video like this, and they'll give you what they think is another underlying foundational problem, and maybe their theory will have a lot of truth to it as well. So I'm not claiming to be completely right or completely having the only true diagnosis of what the problem is here, but I do think I have at least a few things valid to point out here, and it does focus on a central idea. I think the best way that I could summarize my gripe with Christian movies for the past several decades is that I think that Christian movies generally tend to have very small stories. Now, the reason that I would say that I believe Christians tell very small stories in their movies is counterintuitively because I think they're actually far too influenced by the world. And when I say that, I don't mean that Christian movies are worldly per se. I think oftentimes you won't necessarily find the world dismissing Christianity as bad or wrong as often as that can happen. They tend to dismiss it as being subservient to a greater secular agenda. Religion, in the eyes of many in the world, is there to serve the, perhaps, mental health of people. It's there to make people's lives better in one way or another. Religion is fine, but it has its limited place, and you just shouldn't be too religious. Now, can these benefits flow from Christianity? Well, sure, in a sense they really can. But that's not Christianity's job. And that's because Christianity doesn't have a job in that sense. For us, Christianity is an all-encompassing and true vision of the world as it is. As a result, we put our faith in Christ. Therefore, our worldview cannot be put into a box by culture. In a sense, Christianity owns culture because God owns the world, and God's people will inherit the earth. However, in spite of this, I think a lot of Christians have, sometimes consciously, but I think usually unconsciously, they've embraced this vision of Christianity that the world has given them. They've embraced this small box that they want to put us in. Therefore, we end up limiting our stories to this small box. We limit our stories to meeting this need we believe people have. And then maybe if they get this little perk from us, this little emotional boost from us, well, then maybe they'll come over and consider Christianity. But as a result of this, our movies basically just end up being little sermonettes wearing sort of the disguise of a message of positivity. But then we'll throw in little bits in the story where characters come to Christ and get saved and say the sinner's prayer. Because, hey, then maybe some of those worldly people who will never watch this movie will end up saying the sinner's prayer themselves. But if we're going to inherit the earth, and if the earth is the Lord's, then why can't our stories stretch out into all of God's creation in some sense? Why can't our stories be more than just short sermonettes that disguise themselves as boosts of cheap positivity? Christian stories used to take on this kind of authoritative place when Christians used to be the creators of culture. Yes, that used to be the case. It used to be the Christians who would create these great works of fiction. But along the way, we really lost our way. Why can't our stories tackle every realm of emotion and dance around, you might say, in every aspect of God's creation? Why can't we create a truly tragic story that shows what it means to grieve in God's world? Why can't we just tell a straight, dramatic, romantic story? God created romance after all, and there's a way of doing romance in God's world. And why can't we do it without Jesus juking everyone halfway through in some kind of ham-fisted way? Why can't we just tell a straightforward story of heroism? Didn't God create heroism? Now, some discussion of end times theology I actually think relates to this quite a bit, and I really can't go without mentioning it. I'm going to talk about two different perspectives on end times today. Now, there's plenty more perspectives than that, but I think the battle between these two perspectives will really crystallize what I have to say. If you look around the corners of YouTube, you'll see that there are, I'd say, two major perspectives that really have hardened in their ways, as it were. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. We should all, in a sense, be willing to dig in our heels if we believe our theology is correct. But on the one side, you have what you would call dispensational premillennialism. And this is the theology that you see most crystallized in the Left Behind stories, for instance. Now, I already did another video where I summarized these different perspectives on end times, so I'm not going to do it at length here, but dispensational premillennialism, in short, has a much more pessimistic view of the future. They ultimately believe that the earth is going to decay and rebel against God in ever more increasing ways up until the return of Christ, and then the church will ultimately be rescued from this. But on the other side, there is what you would call post-millennialism. And spoiler alert, I would say that I'm inclined to agree much more with this perspective after a certain measure of study on the matter. And this perspective has a much more optimistic view of the future. This view ultimately sees Christ's kingdom as being victorious progressively throughout the history of the church age. And ultimately, the world will be won to Christ before he returns. Now, what on earth does this debate have to do with Christian movies? Well, if the world is going to be won to Christ, then our status, as the Bible states, as strangers and aliens may not mean exactly what we thought. When that was written, the people of God were the first and only Christians, and they really were strangers and aliens among a world of unbelieving people. But again, if the world is going to be more and more won to Christ, and the world is going to be Christianized in some sense, then we may not forever be as isolated as Christians have so often been. In the ultimate sense, the world is and will be ours. Now, dispensationalists, I find, tend to believe that the secular world, particularly Hollywood and the film industry, they see them as doomed. The film industry, ultimately for Christians, might be a little bit of a guilty pleasure, and maybe it's an industry where we might dabble, but in the ultimate sense, the film industry is, again, doomed. And I think this outlook has infected, again, the Christian movie industry in a way that they will only ever see their role as a limited one in the world of the arts and in the world of fiction. We can contribute something here and there that might save a soul or two when it comes to film, but ultimately it's just a distraction that could be compared to, as many have said, rearranging the furniture on a sinking ship. But again, if the world is and will be ours, then stories are ours. Fiction is ours. Art is ours. And it's ours because it's ultimately the Lord's. The world is the Lord's. People often ask, what are the practical implications of putting any kind of emphasis on end times? Many people will simply avoid the issue these days, but here I think is a very practical result of what your end times theology is. So for instance, I think that the people working over at the Daily Wire are beginning to get a bit of a taste of this. Much of their conservatism comes from the Christians who are in their midst. You'll find that their stories are simple, but they're also very broad and entertaining in the most traditional sense. They can be very effective. Now, unfortunately, there is a mixture of secularism in here, and the dangers of some of the ways that the Daily Wire leans I've talked about in other videos. But I would still point to them as an example of what can happen with the proper motivation and the proper use of resources and the proper commitment to quality, not seeing this as a doomed industry. So there you have my thoughts on why I think for at least a long while now Christian movies have had such serious problems, and there's a few thoughts as to what the path forward might be to improve the state of the situation. Some Christians are already beginning to do this, and I think we should pray and encourage them and actually have some form of optimism, and we should really embrace the fact that Christians really can take ownership of art because, again, the world is the Lord's and He is giving it to us. And I think there is a measure to which all of us can embrace this regardless of what our end times theology is. But I still would recommend you check out my other video on end times if you'd like a little bit more details on that. So anyways, thanks for watching this. My name is Eric, and again, this is Grace Nerd. If you enjoyed the video, make sure that you leave a like, and go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell if you want to know when new uploads happen or when live streams happen. If you'd care to support my work, either here or over on my gaming channel, then make sure that you check out my Subscribestar page, which is in the description below, as well as all of my social media links. So again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you around in the next video.